The title of my presentation this evening is The Shape of Holiness, St. Bonaventure's Theology of Grace for Troubled Times. I'd like to start somewhere, perhaps somewhere you might or may not be familiar with, St. Bonaventure's prologue to the major legend of St. Francis. A good place, I think, to see and begin our reflections thinking about what Bonaventure thought holiness actually meant. The grace of God our Savior has appeared in these last days in his servant Francis to all who are truly humble and who are friends of holy poverty. First overcome by the gifts of heavenly grace, which were then increased by the merit of unconquerable virtue, he was fulfilled hierarchicus, lifted on high in a fiery chariot, as should be made brilliantly apparent running through the course of his life. It may be reasonably confirmed that he came in the spirit and power of Elijah. This messenger of God, worthy to be loved by Christ, to be imitated by us, and to be admired by the world, was Francis. Fast forward several hundred years to where we sit in the 21st century United States, and this pithy summation of Francis's sanctity from the major legend might seem at best inaccessible and archaic, and at worst emblematic of those aspects of Christian history most susceptible to contemporary secular critique. Bonaventure here claims that Francis is holy because he is a vir hierarchicus, literally a hierarchical man who comes riding in on a fiery chariot from heaven as God's angelic messenger, a description replete with both apocalyptic and imperial imagery that might rightly make some of us just absolutely cringe. My goal today is simple. Fully acknowledging its cringy quality, I'd nonetheless like to introduce you to Bonaventure's theology of grace by unpacking what he meant by this phrase. From this, I'd also like to explore one way in which this admittedly strange explanation of Francis's holiness might actually matter. The relevance of Bonaventure's teachings on grace and holiness has been underscored as recently as within the February 2025 edition of The Atlantic, which contains a book review of Volker Leppin's The Life of Francis. I admit I have not read that book yet. I intend to, from one of its staff writers, James Parker, appropriately entitled The Saint America Needs Right Now. After summarizing Leppin's book, Parker argues, right now we need St. Francis. Now that kindness is countercultural, we need his extremes of wild charity to pull us back toward it. There are no safe spaces and no guarantees. The only stability is the bottomlessness of divine love, the trapdoor held open by grace. So we take the hand of Francis and down we go. To put my argument today very bluntly, I agree, and I think Bonaventure's theology of grace and its descriptions of Francis's holiness can help us take that plunge too. To that end, what I'll do today is I'll first set the stage for Bonaventure's teachings about grace by framing them in a contemporary lens. Why is Francis the saint we need right now in a countercultural way, as Parker here contends? From this, I'll attempt to summarize Bonaventure's own teachings on grace as I've come to understand them. Essentially, I've elsewhere argued that Bonaventure defines sanctifying grace as a created gift that hierarchizes the human person from within through the three divine activities of purification, illumination, and perfection, otherwise more commonly known as the Threefold Way. I'll do my best to explain what this means and why, but so that we can conclude our time together by perhaps considering why it matters. I suspect that Bonaventure's theology of grace might, if we let it, guide us to an understanding of holiness that will lead us to those extremes of wild charity through which we might yet find our common hope in the bottomlessness of God's love. So part one, grace that packs a punch, holiness in an American context. Whoops. I skipped a little too far ahead there. Considering only the United States, I hardly need point out that we are often bombarded with competing portraits of what holiness looks like according to the Christian story in the media, in our churches, and from the mouths and actions of our elected politicians across both aisles. And a brief word about this particular image. I actually had in mind to use for this presentation an image I grew up seeing of Jesus in a boxing ring. He's kind of up in a corner. He has no shirt on. He has this very flowing hair. Unfortunately, that image was copyrighted, so this is the first time I've stretched my skills by trying to use an AI image, and I think it gets much the same point across. Admitting that I am not a scholar of contemporary religious movements, and also admitting that I cannot possibly here dissect the history of American interpretations of grace, as those should be traced from the Reformation and into our own context, I'd nonetheless like to begin our time together by considering this particular portrait. This, so as to provide a framework for understanding why I find Bonaventure's portrait of holiness via Francis's hierarchical soul so compelling in comparison. To do that, I'm going to do something really weird here and also start with a bit of autobiography. I now find myself in the Episcopal Church while maintaining a deep love and respect for the Catholic Church that has nourished my scholarship and my faith. I was raised in the Presbyterian Church USA. During elementary and middle school, I also attended 2 private Christian academies, one which identified as non-denominational charismatic and the other Southern Baptist. So some of my earliest formative experiences of faith were thus also from those evangelical and Pentecostal perspectives. Though my own faith journey has moved me outside of those spaces, I want to yet respect the very real love I felt and still feel for people in those spaces, who to my knowledge still people them. As a middle schooler, I thus remember countless altar calls exhorting me to publicly stand up and affirm that Jesus Christ was my personal Lord and Savior. To that end, one of those schools, or rather the church with which it was affiliated, staged this production called Blink, a play I remember seeing when I was 10 or 11, and which has been rewritten, reproduced, and continuously staged in the decades since. Its basic premise was this: I could die in the blink of an eye, and if I didn't accept Jesus's grace right then and there, I'd be locked out of heaven forever to burn in hell. I watched story after story play out on stage of people dying horrible, violent deaths, a carjacking, a school shooting, for example, and then had to watch the actors be sent to either heaven or hell after suffering those deaths. Blink expressed this message through dancing demons and angels, smoke machines, and rock music. And at one point during the show, an actor dressed in a muscle suit even emerged as Jesus to literally fight an actor portraying Satan. The ripped Jesus grabbed a prop of the keys to heaven from Satan after knocking him out, and everyone in the congregation cheered and stood on their feet as lasers flashed. I tell you all this not to mock it, but to own it as part of my own introduction to Jesus, to holiness, and to grace. At one point in my youth, I believed in this version of Jesus, the muscular white guy who punches Satan in the face to save me from hell. I believed, moreover, that holiness was characterized by winning other people to heaven so that they'd be saved from eternal damnation too. I wanted the gift of grace because I understood it as the thing that saved me from my sin, because I wanted an individual power source over the thing that scared me most on that stage, a death that ends in hellfire for me and everyone I know. I initially desired the grace that saves, in other words, for entirely selfish reasons, for my own benefit. I want to own this part of my story also because I suspect that this particular portrait of Jesus may be winning out over other portraits of holiness on the national and even international stage. Indeed, in his best-selling book, Matthew D. Taylor has detailed how something like this image of Jesus, and thus also its accompanying understandings of grace, holiness, and power, might inform an ever-burgeoning American Christian nationalism. Specifically, Taylor argues that we have to, and I quote him here, follow the theology behind the Christian symbolism that punctuated and defined the events of January 6th, 2020. His study proceeds to outline that theology with riveting detail, and what emerges, I think, is a distinctly Americanized portrait of holiness that walks hand in hand with the macho Jesus that I encountered in my youth. Some basic components of the spirituality include, and I quote Taylor here, that Christians are engaged in a cosmic spiritual war against the forces of darkness, and that God has mandated them to use spiritual violence to defeat Satan and then build the kingdom of God on earth. This movement now has a broad global reach, and far from being a merely fringe movement, it is one of the fastest growing branches of Christianity in the United States today. Given Taylor's careful research and paired with my own experiences in some of these circles, I can't help but wonder how many of my Christian brothers and sisters within this country possess an understanding of grace that might boil down to this. Faith in Jesus is a ticket to personal salvation that also gives me power. What grace does, most fundamentally, is save me for my benefit. It is an individual affair that turns outward toward other people in the world only insofar as I am thus also responsible for wielding the spiritual power to save them from themselves too. Of course, this is all grossly conjectural on my part, and it bears repeating that I can't possibly analyze the countless understandings of grace that permeate our culture today. As a Christian trying to remain faithful within these troubled times, however, it has never felt more important that I take the time to both understand that portrait of macho Jesus with boxing gloves that captivated me in my youth, even as I feel I must explore some alternative models of holiness and rejection of that portrait's inherent violence. For that, I turn to where we started, to Bonaventure's description of Francis's holiness. What then might St. Bonaventure teach our troubled world about grace? To answer that question, I'd like to highlight a few key characteristics of Bonaventure's doctrine of grace as I've come to understand them while writing my book. The basic premise for this project was built around the seraphic doctor's opening words in the prologue of Francis's major legend, with which we here began, namely that St. Francis was a hierarchical man full of grace. The Bonaventurian scholar Zachary Hayes once intuited, and I quote here, that the structure of hierarchical thought may well shed light on the question of Bonaventure's theology of redemption, and that evidence for this is found in virtually all of his writings, whether they are early or late, and whether they are of an academic speculative sort or of a spiritual mystical nature. Whether or not I actually did this successfully, I'm sure that's arguable. My goal in writing Spiraling into God was to unpack Hayes's intuition in all of these respects. I there argued that the element of hierarchy was indeed an explicit factor within Bonaventure's doctrine of grace throughout his career as a theologian. And though this doctrine, of course, developed somewhat over time, my book tried to demonstrate how this fundamental insight, namely that for Bonaventure, grace makes a person holy by somehow making them hierarchical, nonetheless persisted throughout. So what does any of this mean, and why should we care? To unpack it, I'd like here to focus on three specific features of Bonaventure's theology of grace, which I'll introduce by way of posing some questions. First, what does Bonaventure mean by hierarchy? Second, what does Bonaventure mean by grace? And third, what does he then mean by saying that Francis is a hierarchical man in the beginning of the Legenda Major? So first, what does Bonaventure mean by hierarchy? Many of you now might be thinking that I'm just absolutely off my rocker. Hierarchy, after all, means the very thing I'm trying to get us away from in that image of pro-wrestler Jesus about ready to punch Satan in the face. Most of us, in a modern context, understand a hierarchy is an unjust top-down power structure in which those who find themselves above or on top within that structure will trample, oppress, and suppress those below them within it. If Bonaventure understood grace as that which hierarchizes the soul, as I'm claiming, wasn't he simply perpetuating those same unjust power structures that yield our reverencing a patriarchal, power-hungry, and even violent Jesus? I want to make clear here that I'm deeply sensitive to such concerns, and even more than that, I share them. Consequently, understanding Bonaventure's claim that Francis was full of grace because he was a hierarchical man requires first thinking about what he meant by the word hierarchy. So what do I mean when I say the word hierarchy? What did Bonaventure mean by that? The seraphic doctor's theology of hierarchy was based not in modern understandings of social power structures, but rather in the mysticism of the 6th century pseudonymous author, Dionysius the Areopagite, who actually invented the word in his texts, the celestial hierarchy. I don't here have time to regurgitate a very rich field of scholarship surrounding the meaning of Dionysian thought, but suffice it to say that his represents a breathtaking and often baffling marriage between Neoplatonic philosophy and Christian theology. For our purposes here, it's helpful to be at least somewhat familiar with Dionysius's definition of hierarchy from chapter 3 of the Celestial Hierarchy, which I'm going to read just because I think it's important for setting up Bonaventure. In my opinion, writes Dionysius, a hierarchy is a sacred order, a state of understanding and an activity approximating as closely as possible to the divine, and it is uplifted to the imitation of God in proportion to the enlightenments divinely given to it. The beauty of God, so simple, so good, so much the source of perfection, is completely uncontaminated by dissimilarity. It reaches out to grant every being, according to merit, a share of light, and then through a divine sacrament, in harmony and peace, it bestows on each of those being perfected its own form. The goal of a hierarchy, then, is to enable beings to be as like as possible to God and to be at one with him. For Dionysius and medieval theologians who were inspired by his work, hierarchy was not a social power structure, but a way of being, a sacred order, a state of understanding, and an activity whose purpose was nothing less than union with God, a union which causes us in turn to become as like as possible to God. Dionysius's writings then variously detail how the entire cosmos can relate to God through this divine way of being. Humans through the ecclesiastical hierarchy, or the church, and angels through the celestial or heavenly hierarchy, which he describes as being comprised of 9 holy orders with which you may or may not already be familiar, and they're listed on the screen in front of you. Moreover, Dionysius's writings detail how all of these creatures, whether human or angelic, become as like as possible to God by participating in 3 very specific activities, what he calls the holy work of purification, illumination, and perfection, which will, of course, become Bonaventure's Threefold Way. In his own commentary on the second book of Sentences, Bonaventure repeats and unpacks what he sees as 3 definitions of hierarchy given by Dionysius, which he would have encountered in translations of Dionysius's works by earlier theologians. I'm not going to read this verbatim for the sake of time, but I nonetheless want to use this to highlight what I think are some key components of Bonaventure's theology of hierarchy that here emerge. What's really fascinating about this particular passage is that Bonaventure, if you look at this closely and can compare them, he's actually fudged the order of Dionysius's original text. The celestial hierarchy does not at all imply that these 3 definitions, the first of which is this, the second which is this, the third is this, Dionysius doesn't at all imply that these 3 definitions should be ordered like this. And the second definition given by Bonaventure is actually the first given by Dionysius. So why would Bonaventure do this? I actually think that Bonaventure gives us an answer in his consequent commentary on each definition in his commentary on the second book of Sentences. So I'm just going to focus on this first one here. The first of which is this: a hierarchy is divine beauty, as well as simple, the highest, and consummative. Bonaventure will go on to describe it like this. But the first definition, which is the uncreated hierarchy, expresses it with regard to Trinity and unity, so that Trinity does not come before unity, nor does unity come before Trinity, but unity pertains to the perfection of the Trinity, and the Trinity pertains to the perfection of unity. That's a lot of words, right? What is Bonaventure saying here? Recognizing that this is a very obnoxious sleight of hand on Bonaventure's part, what he's done here is no less significant. Against every modern, rational, and even theological sensibility, he's here reordered Dionysius's text to define hierarchy as the Trinity and unity of God. If a created hierarchy is a way of being, an order, an activity, and a type of knowledge that likens us unto God, it's like Bonaventure saying, wait, hold up. If as Christians, our primary way of being should be to become like God, we first have to understand who and what God is. And who and what God is for Bonaventure is perfect unity in Trinity, a communion of 3 divine persons who subsist in perfect unity, and this is really important, without subordination. Against even Dionysius's original invention and definition of the word, in other words, this is what hierarchy means for Bonaventure. God's ineffable way of being ordered as three persons held together by the unity of divine love. And that means that without subordination, Trinity does not come before unity, nor does unity come before Trinity. No person in the Trinity has more power than the other. They're all on the same level. They're unity in Trinity and vice versa. Bonaventure orders every subsequent discussion of created hierarchies to this particular definition, which brings us then to Bonaventure's understanding of grace. I want to first make a few distinctions surrounding grace that would have been familiar to Bonaventure during the 13th century that might not be so familiar to us. I'm not going to expand these, but it's helpful to know that the medievals would have understood several different types of grace. They talked about helping grace or gratia gratis data. We could talk about operative or cooperative grace. We're here talking about sanctifying grace. In the Latin, gratia gratubatians. Simply put, this is the grace that saves. Second, it's also helpful to know, my PowerPoint isn't working, there it is, that sanctifying grace for Bonaventure was a created gift within the soul, in distinction from the uncreated gift of the Holy Spirit. Theologians in the medieval, in the Middle Ages wanted to distinguish between the created gift of grace in the soul and the uncreated gift to preserve distinctions of causality. I won't get into that right now, but just in case that's helpful for moving forward. As I argued throughout my book, the vocabulary that Bonaventure uses in his explanation of hierarchy that we just saw actually is the vocabulary that he uses throughout his writings to also talk about sanctifying grace in these ways. We see this as early as his commentary on the second book of sentences, where he defines sanctifying grace as follows, and I'm going to dwell here for a minute. He writes, created grace should be compared to an inflowing of light, and its first principle is compared to the sun. So also grace is a spiritual inflowing or influencia or influence that assimilates and conforms rational minds to the source of light. It makes us pleasing, or in post-Reformation speak, it saves us by conforming and assimilating the human person to God. It returns the person to God as a friend and causes them to be pleasing and acceptable to God. For the affect of the human person turns back in on itself and is mercenary, insofar as it is concerned with itself. So, if the person does anything, they do it by tending to their own benefit. But with divine grace coming in, the whole human person is made pleasing, so that whether for the advantage of their neighbor or for the honor of God, they will desire to be totally extended through grace. I want us to notice, first of all, how Bonaventure's language here echoes his treatment of hierarchy that we just encountered. Grace makes us pleasing by conforming us and assimilating us to God, returning us to God as light to its source. It might be helpful here to note that in thus employing this language, the seraphic doctor, like Dionysius before him, is depending upon Neoplatonic notions of causality. What I want us to here note, however, isn't simply the presence of this language in Bonaventure's definition of sanctifying grace, but its function. What is it exactly that makes us pleasing and acceptable to God? In other words, how is it that grace actually saves us, according to Bonaventure in this particular passage? To understand that, I think we also need to understand something about what he thinks original sin does to the human person. For that, I want us to pay close attention to this line. For the affect of the human person turns back in on itself and is mercenary, insofar as it is concerned with itself. When you see the word affect here, think love, that part of our minds and ourselves which is capable of love. We can talk about our intellect and we can talk about our affect on the other hand. So if the person does anything, they do it by tending to their own benefit. Essentially, I want to love myself. And if I do anything, my natural desire is to just love myself and tend to my own benefit. Notably, Bonaventure's doctrine of grace depends upon a common medieval scholastic understanding of Genesis's claim that humanity was created in the image and likeness of God. Following Augustine, many medieval theologians, including Bonaventure, held that the image refers to our rational faculties as human beings. Namely, we were created by God with memory, intelligence, and will. And so our very mind, our intellect, reflects the three persons of the Trinity. That we were created in the likeness of God requires a bit more explanation. In the Breviloquium, Bonaventure will claim that this aspect of likeness, which you can sometimes see referred to as the similitude, can only be found in those spirits which he says are God-conformed. He claims, furthermore, that human beings were actually created with this likeness because they were also created with the gift of sanctifying grace, which gives this divine likeness to them. As he there writes, and I think this is rather helpful, since human beings were liable to fall because of their precarious nature, formed from nothing and not yet confirmed by glory, God bestowed on human beings a twofold perfection of grace. One was a grace freely given. This was a knowledge enlightening the intellect so that they might know themselves, their God, and the world that was made for them. And the other was a grace making them pleasing in God's sight. This was charity, which enabled their affection so that they might love God above all things and their neighbor as themselves. What makes us like God in this sense is love. We become God-conformed when we become like that first hierarchy from Bonaventure's explanation of hierarchy that we just saw. What makes us pleasing to God is the divine charity that pulls our affections into that same divine community, which necessarily then also pulls our affections into loving the rest of creation too. For Bonaventure, what happens in the fall is that human beings lose the second type of grace, sanctifying grace. Instead of using their divinely gifted rational capacities for loving God above all things and their neighbors as themselves, Adam and Eve instead chose to love their own good, their own selfish and carnal desires, more than they loved God and the world around them. The result was that the human soul becomes entirely disordered because of this choice. Though we maintain our rational faculties of memory, intelligence, and will after the fall, or in other words, we remain the image of God, without sanctifying grace, we lose our divine likeness, which means for Bonaventure simply that we have lost our ability to love as God loves. What sin does, in this sense, is kind of make us self-obsessed narcissists, where before our affections were God-conformed by being wrapped up in love, we are now concerned only with our own benefit. Our affect, our love, becomes entirely self-absorbed. For Bonaventure, sanctifying grace returns us to God precisely insofar as it makes us capable of loving a world outside of ourselves in the way that God intended. We are made pleasing, we are saved because the inflowing of sanctifying grace extends our affections to God and to our neighbor. Now then, I think we can return to that claim from St. Francis's major legend with which we started. How does Bonaventure get from his definition of grace as an inflowing that assimilates and conforms the soul to the love of the Trinity in his sentences commentary to this kind of weird claim, right? That Francis is a hierarchical man lifted on high in a fiery chariot. I think that the answer to that question can be found in both Bonaventure's Itinerarium Mentis in Deum, or the journey of the mind into God, and in his collations in Hexameron, or his conferences on the 6 days of creation. The former text, the Itinerarium, is perhaps the most famous of Bonaventure's extant works. It provides, as some of you might already be well aware, a sort of map for contemplative ascent based on Francis's vision of the 6-winged crucified seraph that purportedly appeared to Francis when he was gifted the miracle of the stigmata. Chapter 4 of the Itinerarium talks about the role of grace in that contemplative ascent, wherein Bonaventure writes the following: When we have arrived at these things, he says, our spirit is made hierarchical for the purpose of rising to conformity with the heavenly Jerusalem, in which no one enters unless through grace descending into his heart, as John saw in his Apocalypse. It then descends into the heart when through the reformation of the image, through the theological virtues, through the delights of the spiritual senses and the ecstasy of rapture, our spirit is made hierarchical, namely purified, illuminated, and perfected. For then the 9 levels of orders are marked within it, insofar as they are interiorly disposed in our spirit in an ordered way. So if sin disorders the soul, right, he's here talking about how grace reorders the soul. And he goes along and he names all these kind of strange functions, announcing, dictating, leading, ordering, et cetera, et cetera. This is one of those many passages in the itinerarium that might rightly just cause us to roll our eyes. And maybe it's worth saying that when I first read this as an undergraduate, I thought this was just utter nonsense. What is this? What is Bonaventure saying? What is he doing here? To help us think through it, I'll first note that rather than simply using some hierarchical vocabulary, Bonaventure is here quite explicit. Grace saves us by making our spirits hierarchical. He next quite helpfully explains exactly what he means by making this claim. Grace, he says, purifies, illuminates, and perfects us within by interiorly disposing our spirit into 9 orders of angels, which correspond, as it were, to those 9 orders of angels in the celestial hierarchy that we saw earlier. Though it might seem like it from our perspective, Bonaventure actually isn't pulling this from thin air. Surprise, surprise. There's a little studied theologian from the Victorine School of Theology in the early 13th century named Thomas Gallus, whose entire extant corpus was devoted to unpacking and providing commentary on the works of Dionysius. As one of my mentors from Boston College has extensively detailed, and if you're interested in this, I highly commend this book to you, Gallus's great contribution as a Dionysian commentator lies in his explanation of how the human soul itself, as a microcosm, could be described in terms of those 9 orders of angels named by Dionysius in the celestial hierarchy. Dionysius was a practitioner of what's known in theological speak as apophatic theology, or the negative way. God is beyond anything that we can know or conceive, so ultimately, the mystical union that we experience with God will always surpass our intellectual ability to understand it or describe it. Essentially, Gallus rereads Dionysius's description of the angelic orders into the human soul so that, and you don't have to like read all these nitty-gritty details, but just so that you can see it, he can reinterpret this apophatic union in terms of love. For Gallus, the soul is comprised of 9 orders of angels that culminate in the order of the seraph, to which, as Gallus describes, the sublime ecstasies and exceeding sublimities of every intelligence cannot be drawn, but where only the affection can be united to God. Simply put, where we cannot know God fully, Gallus's notion of the hierarchical soul, it's sometimes called his angelic anthropology, says that we were yet created to be fully united to God in love with our affection. I'm not going to do a point-by-point analysis of this because that would be terrible for you, but what's striking about Bonaventure's description of grace in the itinerarium is that his description of those activities proper to the graced soul that we just saw actually correspond exactly to Gallus's prior presentation of the same. And lest we be tempted to think that this is some kind of weird coincidence, Bonaventure actually goes on to name the abbot of Vercelli, or Thomas Gallus, in his subsequent expansion of these same themes in the Collations and Hexameron. As his career as a theologian progresses, in other words, Bonaventure makes the implicit associations between hierarchy and grace from his Sentences commentary more explicit. He does so, moreover, by taking Thomas Gallus's notion of the hierarchical soul or his angelic anthropology and basically just like dropping it into his doctrine of grace. How does sanctifying grace save us for St. Bonaventure? It saves us by causing us to become likened to God in love. Where sin makes us mercenary and self-absorbed, grace purifies, illuminates, and perfects the soul. It hierarchizes it by making it capable of the affective union with God at the order of the seraph previously described by Gallus. All right, you might be thinking that that's slightly interesting and also kind of weird, but why does any of this actually matter? My first instinct when confronted with all of these ideas is to interpret them from the vantage point of that little girl who watched a play about believing in Jesus so that I could get into heaven. If I see the phrase hierarchy or mystical ascent into God, my initial instinct is to read this in a sort of bottom-up way so that I can empower myself to become some sort of like super saint like Francis. What steps can I follow to ensure that I ascend to God? And then I need go no further, right? But then, of course, I would be leaning into those same mercenary, self-absorbed tendencies that we talked about earlier. Indeed, what emerged in my study of Bonaventure's many descriptions of the soul's hierarchization through grace was the very clear idea that such hierarchical ordering within the soul cannot and should not be understood in a merely linear way. For Bonaventure, to be called holy, to be called hierarchical, does not simply mean that the soul has ascended to a contemplative union with God that is a stopping point in a bottom-up spiritual journey. Rather, for Bonaventure, to call a soul hierarchical indicates that the soul has been made capable of loving God above all things and loving our neighbors as ourselves. It refers simultaneously to an ascent towards the type of contemplative, affective union with God described by Gallus that is always also paired with a descent to loving our neighbor too. One of Bonaventure's favorite images for depicting this notion is the scriptural image of Jacob's ladder from Genesis 28, which we can see here in his description of how grace shapes the soul in the Hexameron. Here's a more recent interpretation of that image by William Blake, which I used for my book cover. You'll notice, of course, that there are figures both going up and down the staircase in Blake's painting, capturing the spirit of the Genesis text, which describes angels both ascending and descending between heaven and earth in Jacob's dream. You'll notice also, however, that Blake's painting does not actually depict a ladder, but a staircase that spirals into the heavens. Similarly, for the seraphic doctor, there is no end point in some sort of bottom-up mystical journey of ascent. Rather, to be made hierarchical through grace for him means to find oneself relating to God in creation in ever deeper, fuller, and more fruitful ways into perpetuity. Holiness, in this sense, is an endless spiraling of the soul between God and creation and between contemplation and action. We are now finally then, I think, prepared to return to Bonaventure's claim in the Major Legend that St. Francis was a hierarchical man. If we jump ahead in that same text, we can observe Bonaventure carrying some of these same insights throughout. Previous scholarship has already underscored how the entire Major Legend of St. Francis can be interpreted through Bonaventure's understanding of the three movements of purification, illumination, and perfection. To that end, chapter 13 of the Major Legend treats what's often understood as the sort of climactic moment in the story of Francis's saintly life, namely his reception of the miracle of the stigmata, or the wounds of the crucified Christ atop Mount Alverna. I want us to notice, first of all, why Bonaventure thinks Francis merited to receive this gift. In chapter 13 of the Major Legend, when he's introducing the miracle of the stigmata, he writes, "Those sacred wounds were imprinted in him by the power of the one who, through a seraphic work, purifies, illuminates, and inflames. And, moreover, it was custom for the angelic man Francis never to rest from the good. Rather, like the heavenly spirits on Jacob's ladder, he was either ascending into God or descending to his neighbor." Simply put, I don't think we should read these explanation of Francis's holiness in chapter 13 apart from Bonaventure's claim at the beginning of the Major Legend that Francis was a hierarchical man. nor do I think we should read them apart from his broader teachings on grace, hierarchy, and holiness. What the stigmata prove for St. Bonaventure is that sanctifying grace had so transformed Francis's soul into those Dionysian hierarchical orders that his whole person, soul, and body was conformed into the Trinity's likeness. Francis was inflamed by the seraphic union with God previously described by Thomas Gallus, and this is what invites the miracle of the stigmata into his flesh. And whereas my own temptation is to regard the stigmata as the sort of end of the story of Francis's holiness, notice then how Bonaventure then continues the major legend in chapter 14. As he writes, "Thus now fixed with Christ to the cross in both flesh and with his spirit, Francis not only burned with a seraphic love in God, but was also thirsting with Christ crucified for the multitude of those to be saved. Since he could not walk because of the nails coming out of his feet, he had his dying body carried around the cities and towns so that others would be animated to carry the cross of Christ. He also burned with a great desire to return to his beginning in humility, that he might minister to the lepers as he did at the beginning." For Bonaventure, Francis was a hierarchical man, not only because he experienced a mystical union with God in love through the miracle of the stigmata, but also because the divine love Francis there experienced goaded him to a deeper love of the world around him. Francis was so conformed to the love of the Trinity that he thirsted, with Christ crucified, to humbly return to minister to the least of these in his midst. As I sit down to conclude these remarks, my news feeds are overflowing with images and articles reminding me of what's at stake in all these considerations of what holiness means in our contemporary context. Sifting through the endless barrage of awful, I'm reminded that our perceptions of grace will always ultimately boil down to our understanding of Jesus as well. Do we see in the person of Christ permission for our violence, or do we see the naked, crucified Christ, the one whose divine body was pierced in an act of self-emptying mercy? With that, I suspect that Parker was right about Francis's usefulness for our present situation, namely that the Poverello's holiness might yet help us resist the weaponization of our faith. How do we understand that holiness? Does grace save us only for the purpose of getting us a ticket to heaven? Is it, moreover, a power we wield over others to force them to comply with our own image of that heaven? In this fraught context, Bonaventure's teachings on holiness via Francis's hierarchical person remind us of the necessarily selfless purpose of saving grace. What grace accomplishes within us is the transformation of our souls and even our bodies into nothing less than the likeness of God. A likeness defined by Bonaventure is the capacity to love God above all things and our neighbors as ourselves. In this portrait of holiness, archaic though it may be, grace saves us by making us capable of God's way of being in the love of the Trinity, a love which seeks not power, but an ever-fruitful, overflowing compassion that leads us finally to thirst with Christ crucified to serve always the least of these. When our sin will inevitably direct our affections toward our own selfish benefit, and it will, for me that happens on the daily, Bonaventure, looking to Francis and Christ crucified above him, remind us that grace saves us precisely by reshaping us into creatures capable of such selfless divine love. Thank you.